with a voicemail from Dad. They want you out by tomorrow. The words hit harder than the church bell outside. Silence cracked down the eyes like ice, thin and sharp, with a voicemail from Dad. Two men in dark suits stood beside me, one holding a white envelope as though it were a gift wrapped in threat. My gloves tightened. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the leather whispering under strain. On behalf of Mrs. Judith Ellison, the taller one said, his voice flat, as if he'd rehearsed it 100 times. Through the buzzwhip of the voice from Dad, the other's eyes flicked toward the back of the church. I followed the glance. Judith stood there, navy silk skimming her frame, with a voicemail from pearls resting like moonlight at her throat. Her eyes met mine for a heartbeat, softened, then cooled to something unreadable. Regret. No. Calculation. Her blitz with a voicemail from Dad. Her lips moved almost imperceptibly. I caught the shape of the words. It was never yours. The envelope slid into my hands. My name was written in looping script, with a voicemail from Dad, deliberate and unfamiliar. Around us, carnations scented the air, sweetness already curling toward decay. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. A draft from the open door carried the salt tang of the harbor, cold against the back of my neck. I nearly stood. My knees shifted before my mind caught up. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I wanted her to see me rise, to make her say it aloud before everyone. This is mine. He was mine, but the coffin was only steps away, my father lying inside, with a voicemail from Dad. To speak now would be to fracture the last quiet moment we had. You are to vacate the Ellison residence within 24 hours, the man repeated. Silence for the voicemail from Dad were words mercenal. Whispers unfurled behind me, delicate as spider silk yet heavy on my skin. I turned slightly, catching the brief. With a voicemail from Dad, embarrassed glance of a neighbor before he looked away. Judith stayed where she was, letting the murmurs tighten around me like a noose. Brought unbuzzed with a voicemail from Dad. When the final hymn ended and the pews emptied, she came forward. Jasmine, laced with a metallic undercurrent, arrived before her voice. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, she leaned close enough their herb pearls grazed my shoulder. It's for the best, Margaret, she murmured. Her gaze drifted to the stained glass window, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad where fractured blues and blowed across the pew. Some things, she added softly, were never meant to be yours. He outside. With a voicemail from Dad. The wind from the harbor cut like a blade, sharp with salt and iron. I stood on the church steps as the hearse pulled away. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the envelope pressed hard against my chest. The fading scent of carnations clung stubbornly, like truths that refused to disappear. 2 years ago, with a voicemail, my father had pressed a small brass key into my palm. No words, just a look, steady and unreadable. Sipping my latte when buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, that planted itself in me like a warning I wasn't ready to understand. I still didn't know what the key opened. But in the last 6 months, a voicemail from Dad. Judith had stripped the study bare. The attic door was gone. And yesterday, I'd found the shed unlocked, the old toolbox missing. The key was still mine, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. And if what I suspected was true, it would burn everything Judith had built to the ground. By the time I reached the house, with a voicemail from Dad, dusk had blurred the line between sea and sky. The shingles, silvered by decades of salt air, caught the last light in a way that almost looked familiar. Almost. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad inside, the quiet was different, emptier. The faint creak of the floorboards under my boots no longer felt like a welcome but an echo. When my phone unbuzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I set the envelope on the hall table without looking at it again. My eyes traced the curve of the staircase, the polished banister my father had sanded himself. When my foes with a voicemail from Dad, I could still see him at the bottom step holding out a steaming mug after a winter storm. I rubbed at a smudge on the window glass. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. My hand came away streaked with dust. The harbor view was still there, but the warmth it once carried had thinned. I sank into the armchair when my phone buzzed with voicemail from Dad. The one angled just right tight to catch both the tide and my father's voice when he read aloud from the paper. It was here, 5 summers ago, with a voicemail from Dad, that he first brought Judith. She stepped onto the porch in a dress too thin for the breeze, smile wide but never quite meeting her eyes, with a voicemail from Dad. Her gaze flicked over the railing, scanning the yard as though measuring it. My father's hand rested lightly at her back. Margaret? From Dad, this is Judith? He'd said, warmth threading his voice. I shook her hand, cool, firm, and offered coffee. She accepted, forping my lip when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, but her attention drifted to the photographs on the mantel. She paused at my parents' wedding picture, her expression unreadable. That summer, with a voicemail from Dad, Judith was pleasant enough. She laughed at my father's dry humor, helped in the kitchen, asked about my work at the library. When my phone unbuzzed with a voicemail from Dayette, there were moments that lodged in me. The way she lingered in the study, tracing the spines of books my father rarely loaned out. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, how she asked casual questions about the attic, her tone light but her eyes calculating. Had he known what she was doing? Had he let her in? When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, even to the parts of him he kept sealed from me? Part of me wanted to believe he'd never let her touch what mattered. Another part wasn't so sure. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. A board near the pantry creaked louder than I remembered. I glanced toward the sound, but the house gave nothing back. Outside, the tide was turning, waves breaking in slow, deliberate intervals. The brass key in my coat pocket pressed cold against my side. Tomorrow, with a voicemail from Dad, I would find the lock and whatever she didn't want me to see. After that first summer, with a voicemail from Dad, Judith's presence in the house grew in ways that were hard to name at first. A new rug in the hallway, winds might buzz with a voicemail from Dad, curtains replaced with heavier drapes that shut out the afternoon light. Shelves rearranged so that the books my father loved most were no longer within reach. With a voicemail from Dad, she began spending hours in the study, saying she was helping him organize papers. I'd pass by and hear the soft thud of drawers opening. When buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the faint rustle of envelopes. Once I caught her at the attic door, fingers on the old brass knob, her smile quick and unconvincing when she noticed me. With a voicemail from Dad, my father insisted she was making the place more livable. I tried to believe him. With a voicemail from Dad, tried to ignore the way family photographs started disappearing from the walls, replaced by abstract prints in muted tones. With a voicemail from Dad, even the smell of the house changed, cedar and salt giving way to something sharper like lemon polish and a perfume I didn't recognize. In the kitchen, with a voicemail from Dad, the familiar chipped mugs vanished, replaced by delicate china cups I never saw her use. My favorite chair in the living room was moved to the corner, if with a voicemail from Dad, angled away from the harbor view. I told myself it was just change, nothing more. But each alteration felt like a piece of my father's world being carefully, with a voicemail from Dad, quietly rewritten. I shifted now in that same corner chair, the lamplight casting a small island of gold in the dim room. The rest of the house lay in shadow. Phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I could almost hear Judith's measured footsteps in the hallway, the click of her heels against the wood, the pause before a door opened. Somewhere above me, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, a faint draft whispered through a seam in the ceiling, the place where the attic door had been before it vanished entirely. I'm buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I wondered what had been taken out before the floorboards were patched. My father had never spoken of it, or perhaps he had, in ways I hadn't understood. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. A gull's cry cut through the muffled sound of the tide. I rose and crossed to the coat rack, my fingers brushing against the rough fabric of my old jacket. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The weight of the brass key was still there, colder now than when he'd pressed it into my hand 2 years ago. The memory of his gaze, steady, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, unreadable, settled over me like the first chill of autumn. I stood, in the quiet, listening to the distant rhythm of waves and the creak of the settling house. So in for the buzz with a voicemail from Dad. Whatever lock the key belonged to, it hadn't been found by her yet, and before she forced me out, I intended to open it. The next morning, with a voicemail from Dad. Sunlight cut across the kitchen in thin, pale stripes. I was pouring coffee when Judith's heels clicked down the hallway, sharp, deliberate. Voicemail from Doubt fell Claudette. Nyan Vaude without glancing at me, heading straight for the cabinet above the sink. We'll need this space cleared, she said. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, pulling down my father's enamel coffee pot, the one he'd used every morning for 30 years, she set it on the counter as if it were a broken tool. With a voicemail from Dad, I kept my voice even. That's his it stays. Who she turned then, her smile the kind you give to a child who doesn't understand the rules. Margaret, with a voicemail from Dad, it's outdated. Some things are better replaced. Her hand brushed the rim of the pot, nails catching the light. Before I could reply, a phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The back door opened and 2 of her friends stepped in, neighbors I'd known since childhood. Their conversation faltered as they noticed me. Buzzed, Judith didn't miss mail. From Dad, Judith didn't miss the moment. She insists on clinging to things that don't serve her anymore, Judith said, her tone, pitched just loud enough for them. Dad, it's sad, really. The words landed like a slap. My fingers tightened around the coffee mug, heat pressing into my palm. For a moment, with a voicemail from Dad, I imagined setting it down hard enough to crack the ceramic. My knees shifted, ready to stand, to answer her in full view of the witnesses she'd chosen. Voicemail, Dad. Instead, I took a slow breath. Some things, I said quietly, aren't meant to be replaced. My voice didn't tremble. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, though my heart beat hard against my ribs. Judith's smile held, but her eyes cooled. She turned back to her friends, steering them toward the dining room. Tipping my lat when Theron buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, their voices rose again light and practiced as if the last exchange hadn't happened. I stayed in the kitchen, letting the silence rebuild itself, with a voicemail from Dad. The coffee pot sat between us on the counter, its handle worn smooth by my father's hand. I traced the metal when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, feeling the slight dent near the base, a mark from when he dropped it during a storm years ago. That dent had been part of our mornings, part of him. A voicemail from a floorboard creaked in the dining room. Judith's laughter followed, clear and deliberate. I set the mug down, with a voicemail from Dad. My fingers brushing against the coat draped over the chair. The weight of the brass key was still there, solid and cold. Upstairs, Caldard buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I heard the faint scrape of a drawer. She was moving through my father's things again. My pulse quickened, but I stayed rooted, with a voicemail from Dad. There would be a time to act soon. For now, I memorized the sound of each step, each pause, as if mapping the rooms she'd already claimed, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The tide outside was rising. You could feel it in the air, in the subtle shift of the wind against the windows. Something in me shifted with it, with a voicemail from Dad. The restraint I'd clung to beginning to thin. By mid-afternoon, Judith had moved her guest into the parlor. Selef and home buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The low hum of conversation drifted down the hall, punctuated by clinks of china and polite laughter. I stayed in the kitchen folding the same dish towel twice, buzzed with a voicemail from Dagan, trying to quiet the restless energy in my hands. Her voice carried, light and deliberate, a voicemail from Dad. It's remarkable how some people can live in a place for decades and never make it their own. A pause, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, then the quick intake of breath from someone beside her, the sound of a teacup set too hard into its saucer. I stepped into the doorway, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The three of them sat near the bay window, the afternoon light pouring in around them. Judith's gaze slid over me as though I'd interrupted something private. Forward on my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. We were just discussing, she said, how much work it will be to bring this house up to standard once it's mine to manage. The words hit low. Kalgame from Dated? My jaw tightened. It's not yours to manage, I said, keeping my tone steady. Not yet. Her friends exchanged glances, with a voicemail from Dad, that quick flicker of shared judgment. Judith leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs slowly. You've been given time to pack, she said. What's the voicemail from Dad? That's more consideration than most would get. Something in my chest pressed outward, sharp and urgent. I saw my father in the doorway of the study. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the way he'd stand with his arms folded, watching the harbor as if it could tell him what came next. I wondered what he would have said to her. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I wondered if he'd have said anything at all. A breeze slipped in through the cracked window, stirring the lace curtain against my arm. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the scent of carnations from the funeral arrangement in the corner mixed with the sharper smell of lemon polish. I took one step into the room, then another, with a voicemail from Dad, the floorboards carrying the weight of each choice. You might want to be careful, Judith, I said quietly. Some things aren't as secure as you think. Her eyes narrowed, but she smiled for her audience. Are you threatening me, Margaret? No, I said, with a voicemail from Dad. Just reminding you, locks can be opened, even the ones you don't see. For a moment, the air felt still enough to hold. Then her friends shifted. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, breaking it, and Judith turned her head toward the window, dismissing me without a word. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. But I saw the flicker in her expression, a crease at the corner of her mouth that hadn't been there a second ago. I left the parlor, my pulse steady now, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. In the hallway, I paused by the coat rack, letting my hand rest on the jacket pocket. The brass key pressed cold against my fingertips, with a voicemail. From Dad, from upstairs, came the sound of a drawer sliding open then closing, not in my room, but in my father's. I stood very still when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, listening to her footsteps move toward the study. The next sound was faint but unmistakable, the click of a lock turning. The one and my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. And it wasn't one I've ever given her. The knock came just after 9. Sharp, businesslike. I was still at the kitchen table, nursing coffee gone lukewarm. With it a voicemail for when Judith walked in from the front hall with a tall man in a charcoal suit. "This is Mr. Halpern," she said. "Has here to help us finalize some things." The word finalize lodged in my chest. Halpern gave me a polite nod. "From Dad." Setting a slim leather case on the dining table, the scent of his aftershave, something crisp. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, chemical clashed with the lingering smell of toast and sea air drifting through the open window. Judith gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit, Margaret." My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. "It's nothing complicated." I didn't move. "What things?" She exchanged a quick glance with Halpern, the kind you can miss if you're not looking. With a voicemail from Dad. He opened the case and withdrew a neat stack of documents, sliding them toward me. "These are standard transfer agreements," he said, buzzed with a voicemail. "From Dad, they'll make the transition smoother." My fingers brushed the edge of the top page. Legal language crowded the paper in dense blocks. Gus with a voicemail from Dad. Somewhere near the bottom, my name appeared above a blank line. I read the heading again of property reassignment. "This isn't standard," I said. Judith's tone sharpened. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, "It's simply to ensure the house and all associated accounts are managed properly after you leave." The phrase "all associated accounts" tugged at me. From Dad, I set the paper down. "I haven't agreed to leave." She sighed, leaning back. "Margaret, you can't hold on to everything." What am I bust with a voicemail from Dad? My lawyer assures me this will avoid complications. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the pause. That followed. Outside, gulls wheeled above the harbor. Bush with a voicemail from Dad, their cries cutting into the silence. My palms felt damp against the tabletop. Part of me wanted to tear the papers in half. The voicemail from Dad, to see the words there scatter like gulls startled into flight. But I kept my hands still. "I'll need time to review these," I said. With a voicemail from Dad, Halpern slid the stack closer. "The sooner they're signed, the better." This voicemail from Dad. "There's also a release form regarding certain funds." "What funds?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. Judith's smile tightened. With a voicemail from Dad. "Small accounts your father maintained. They need to be consolidated." I glanced at her, then back to the papers. With a voicemail from Dad. The brass key in my jacket pocket felt suddenly heavier, as if reminding me of its own quiet authority. My father had never mentioned multiple accounts. But then, with a voicemail from Dad. In recent years, there had been more for closed doors, more private conversations between him and Judith. "I'll think about it," I said finally. With a voicemail from Dad. Her gaze held mine, a flicker of irritation beneath the practiced calm. "Don't take too long. Some opportunities have a window." When they left, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the dining room felt cooler, as though they'd taken some warmth with them. I gathered the papers, meaning to put them aside. But as I stacked them, with the voicemail from Dad, something caught my item. Half hidden, it bore my signature. Only, I had never signed it. I sat back down at the table. With a voicemail from Dad, the forged signature staring up at me. The loops were close, but the angle of them was wrong. Too upright, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Lacking the slight lean my hand had carried for decades. Whoever had done this had studied me, but not enough. I pulled the rest of the stack toward me. With a voicemail from Dad. Page after page, the language blurred into a web of clauses and subclauses, most of them tying my father's name and mine. From Dad to transfer of rights and or revocable consent. The dates were recent. Too recent. A draft crept through the open window. When I'm buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, rattling in the chain on the blinds, I reached for my reading glasses, but my hands hesitated halfway. The thought came, quick and hard, if I confronted her now, with a voicemail from Dad, she'd have time to cover whatever else she'd set in motion. If I waited, I could watch, track, gather proof. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I slid the suspect page free and tucked it into the envelope from the day before. My coat pocket swallowed the weight of it alongside the brass key. When my phone buzzed with a Molzuffer from Dad, I heard 2 pieces of a puzzle I hadn't yet seen. From the hallway came Judith's voice, low, measured, speaking into her phone. "Yes, by the end of the week." With a voicemail from Dad. "No, she doesn't suspect." The words thinned as she moved toward the front door. A moment later, the latch clicked shut. I took the opportunity. In the study, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the scent of lemon polish was stronger, layered over something faintly metallic like coin or brass. Drawers sat neatly closed, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, but the wastebasket was half full. I knelt, pulling out crumpled sheets, drafts of letters to the bank, some in Judith's handwriting, iced with a voicemail from Dad, others typed with my father's name typed neatly at the bottom. The dates matched the ones on the forged documents. My throat tightened. With flutter buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I set the papers back exactly as they'd been, then turned to the desk. The locked drawer was ajar by a fraction, as if closed in haste. With a voicemail from Dad. Inside lay an empty checkbook, the register torn away. The last recorded withdrawal was weeks before my father died. With a voicemail from Dad, a thin film of dust outlined where something rectangular had sat, about the size of a small lockbox. Gone now. Footsteps sounded on the porch. With a closed mail from Dad, I closed the drawer and stepped back, forcing my hands to rest loosely at my sides. Judith entered, a grocery bag looped over one arm. "Still here?" she said, with a voicemail from Dad, scanning the room as if expecting to find something out of place. "I was looking for the phone book," I said, my voice steady. "Mail from Dad. Can't seem to remember where it's kept." She gave a small smile, setting the bag on the desk. Things change. I left her there and went upstairs. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, locking my bedroom door. From my nightstand, I took out the worn leather ledger my father had kept for years, flipping through the pages. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, my eye caught a final entry scribbled in his hand, shaky but clear, a deposit into an account I didn't recognize. The figure was large, with a voicemail from Dad. Much larger than anything he'd moved before. I grabbed my phone and called the bank, pressing the receiver tight to my ear. With a voicemail from Dad. The hold music was faint under the thud of my own heartbeat. When the voice finally came, the answer was simple and cold. The account had been emptied. With a voicemail from Dad 2 hours after his funeral. 2 mornings later, the phone barely rang. The few calls that did come went to voicemail. Neighbors canceling visits. With a voicemail from Dad. Cousins suddenly busy. Even the church group, which usually checked in, sent a brief message instead of stopping by, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The quiet was heavier than the sound of waves outside. It pressed in, filling corners I'd never known could feel so small. I made tea and forgot about it, with a voicemail from Dad, watching steam thin into nothing. The tea sat cold. Somewhere in the distance, a foghorn sounded, low and patient. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, for a moment it sounded like the house calling into emptiness. I walked the hallway slowly, touching the places my father's hands had polished. With a voicemail from Dad, the banister curve, the cabinet pull, the dented edge of the old kitchen table. Each touch felt like striking a match that wouldn't take. With a voicemail from Dad, the photographs Judith had removed left blank islands on the walls that made the room look erased. I saw Emily on the path that afternoon. Fernand, her school bag slung over one shoulder. She slowed when she saw me on the porch rail. "Grandma," she said, climbing the steps. When my phone buzzes with a voicemail from Dad says we shouldn't stay long, but I wanted to check on you. Her hair smelt faintly of salt and shampoo, clean and ordinary. A reminder the world still keeps tiny promises. I held her longer than she expected. "I'm fine," I said. "Mail from Dad? Just quiet around?" Here, the words sounded obedient and untrue. She hesitated, toe tracing a half circle on the porch board. "Boys," with a voicemail from Dad. "Aunt Judith's been telling people you're stressed, that maybe you need rest. Alone." The last word came softly, as if it hurt to say. "From Dad." "Is that what you think?" I asked. Emily shook her head quickly. "I think she's scared you'll find something." Her eyes flicked toward the house when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from. Then away, like a bird testing air. I wanted to ask what she'd heard, which adult sentence had leaked that fear, but I didn't. With a voicemail from Dad, protecting her felt more urgent than gathering facts. When she left, the air cooled by a shade I could feel on my skin. The gulls circled lower than usual. Smear from Dad, shadows sliding over the porch boards like wet hands. I went inside and checked the study. The wastebasket was empty now, every scrap gone. With a voicemail from Dad. The desk drawers were locked tight, scratches near the keyholes freshly polished as if the wood had been told to forget. Upstairs, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I stood at the window overlooking the shed. The door was closed, the padlock in place, but the weeds along the path were freshly crushed. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. A greenbusy running toward the threshold. My father's tools had always lived in that shed, along with the things he kept out of sight: spare hinges, rope. With a voicemail from Dad, secrets heavy enough for wood. The brass key in my pocket felt almost warm against my fingers. as if answering my pulse. Part of me wanted to run out now, with a voicemail from Dad. Force the lock, let truth be whatever shape it was. Another part warned that rushing would give her time to erase the next thing. Voicemail from Dad. A floorboard outside my room creaked. One long board that speaks even under careful feet. A shadow pooled under the door paused, then withdrew, with a voicemail from Dad. The footsteps moved away unhurried, confident down the stairs. I stood still until the front door shut and the house exhaled. From the window, profile what was with a voicemail from Dad. I watched Judith idle at the curb, engine low, a sound that gets into your bones. Judith emerged, speaking to someone in the passenger seat. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, she handed over a folder thin, but enough to hold the wrong papers. They drove away without looking back, and the quiet returned, not empty now, but waiting. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Night pressed against the windows, the kind that swallowed the coastline whole. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I didn't bother with the lamps in the living room. Just let the blue of the television I wasn't watching flicker across the walls. With a voicemail from Dad. The shadows in the corners seemed to lean closer. Judith's footsteps had been absent for hours, but her presence lingered. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, woven into the way the thermostat was set a few degrees lower than comfort, the faint scent of her perfume clinging to the air like a claim. When my phone buzzed with the voicemail from Dad, even the tick of the man-to-tell clock sounded altered, more deliberate as though marking time she owned. I sat on the couch with my coat still on, with a voicemail from Dad, hands folded over my lap. The brass key pressed a faint ridge against my thigh. I kept my fingers near it without taking it out. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, that the way you might rest your hand on a wound you're not ready to expose. The phone rang once, sharp in the stillness, before I picked it up. Tame buzzed with a voicemail on Emily's voice came through, soft but urgent. Grandma, I just wanted to check on you. Did anything happen today? I hesitated, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, hearing the rustle of comforter, picturing her in her dorm room miles away, the glow of her laptop on her face. I'm fine. I lied, with a voicemail from Dad, the words tasting thin. She didn't press, just said, I miss you, before promising to visit when she could. After we hung up, the buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The silence filled in faster than before. I let my eyes drift to the far wall where the photograph of my father still hung. He was younger in it, with a voicemail from Dad, standing on the porch in his work shirt, one hand shielding his eyes from the sun. Behind him, barely visible. When my phone was with a voicemail from Dad was the attic window. Back when it still had curtains, back when it belonged to both of us. I thought of the attic now, door gone. With a voicemail from Dad. Now space sealed without explanation. Judith had claimed it was for safety, the flooring too weak. But I remembered walking there just months before, with a voicemail from Dad. The boards solid under my feet, the air smelling of cedar and dust. My mind flickered to the way she lingered in the study after the funeral, with a voicemail from Dad, fingertips drifting along the spines of books as if reading titles she already knew by heart. The desk drawers had been shut too quickly when I passed, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The question I had been avoiding all day rose again, heavier than before. Had my father trusted her with things he never shared with me? Cone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Or had he hidden them from her as carefully as he had from the rest of the world? I wanted to believe the latter. But doubt, once invited, made itself at home. With a voicemail from Dad, the wind picked up outside, rattling a loose pane in the kitchen. It was an old sound, one I'd known since childhood. Were my telephone buzzed with a voice lamp from Dad, yet tonight it felt different, less like weather, more like a warning. I stood and moved to the hall closet, pulling out the same coat I'd worn to the service. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the key was still in the pocket, colder now, as if it had been waiting for me to notice its weight again. Tomorrow I would stop imagining and start finding. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The locket belonged to Wong, was somewhere close. I could feel it. And whatever it opened, Judith didn't want me to see. Was with a voicemail from Dad. That thought steadied me in a way nothing else had since the morning. I hung the coat by the door, ready for dawn. The sea would still be there. Was with a voicemail from Dad. The wind still cutting sharp, but I would walk into it with purpose. The brass key would lead me to the truth. And this time, I wouldn't look away. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The invitation had arrived as a formality, a cream card in Judith's handwriting, though the gathering was in the same house I'd been told to leave. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. A memorial luncheon, she'd called it. I almost didn't go, but some part of me wanted to see her on her own stage. By the time I arrived, with a voicemail from Dad, the place was already crowded. The smell of roasted lamb mingled with the salt from the open windows, and voices rose in overlapping waves. When buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, Judith stood near the French doors, a glass of wine in hand, her dress the color of wet slate. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, she didn't greet me, just glanced over as if confirming I'd shown up within minutes. A woman I didn't recognize pressed a tray into my hands. With a voicemail from Dad. "Could you take these to the patio?" The words came with a smile that wasn't really hers. It was borrowed from Judith. I hesitated, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, but the weight of the silver tray made the choice for me. The glasses trembled against each other as I stepped outside. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the conversations hushed just enough for me to notice. Eyes followed me, not with warmth but with that polite curiosity reserved for someone on the fringe. The phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. A man I remembered from my father's fishing trips nodded, then looked away before I could speak. I placed the tray down and retreated inside, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Judith intercepted me in the hall, her voice light enough to carry over the guests. "Could you check on the dessert?" With a voicemail from Dad. "The kitchen staff is swamped." There was no staff. There never had been. I nodded anyway. In the kitchen, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The clatter of plates was replaced by the tick of the clock above the pantry. I took my time arranging the tarts on a platter, with a voicemail from Dad. Listening to the faint scrape of a chair in the study. No one should have been in there. The door had been closed since the funeral, with a voicemail from Dad. When I stepped into the hall, I caught a glimpse through the half-open study door. A man in a dark suit stood with his back to me, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, flipping through a leather-bound ledger. His hands moved quickly, pages fanning. Before I could speak, Judith appeared at my side. "Margaret," she said. The voicemail from Dad. Her smile fixed. "They're asking for coffee outside." Her hand rested briefly on my arm, light but enough to steer me away from the door, with a voicemail from Dad. When I glanced back, the study was closed again. Outside, I set down the coffee and listened to the hum of voices return, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. My humiliation wasn't in the tasks. It was in the ease with which she made them mine, as if I had always been part of the service. Even Emily, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, seated at the far table, looked uneasy. Judith rose to make a toast. "Albert believed in family," she said, her gaze sweeping the tables. With a voicemail from Dad. "He believed in loyalty, and he believed in knowing one's place." Her eyes caught mine for a fraction of a second before she smiled into her glass. With a voicemail from Dad. The words settled heavier than the sea air. Around me, cutlery scraped against porcelain, chairs shifted. I thought of the key in my coat pocket by the door. With a buzz with a voicemail, from "Cold and Patient," a gull cried overhead, sharp enough to cut through the applause. My fingers curled against my palm, nails pressing crescents into the skin. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I wanted to stand, to speak, to tear through the polished surface she'd laid over my father's memory. But instead, with a voicemail from Dad, I smiled. Because she wasn't ready for the moment I would. For now, I would serve the coffee. I would pass the plates. And I would watch. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, because whatever had been in that ledger, Judith didn't want me to see it. And that meant it mattered. The plates cleared slower than the tide, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Every fork scraped, pulling time out longer than it needed to be. Judith kept her post near the French doors, greeting each guest as they left the table. Can my fuzz with a voicemail from Dad, her hand brushing sleeves, her smile warm for everyone but me. I carried another stack of dessert plates toward the kitchen. Halfway there, with a voicemail from Dad, I heard Judith's voice rise just enough to carry. "Margaret's always been so hands-on. She insists on helping." A ripple of polite laughter followed. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The words weren't cruel on their surface, but I felt the sting in their weight, the implication that I belonged behind the scenes, not among them. With a voicemail from Dad, Emily brushed past me whispering, "Do you want me to?" "No," I said, forcing a smile. "Just enjoy yourself?" She nodded. With a voicemail from Dad, but her eyes lingered as if she knew I was lying. When the last plates were stacked, the living room filled again for coffee. With a voicemail from Dad, Judith poured herself a glass of red and launched into a story about Albert's generosity. Every detail was chosen, every pause deliberate. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, like she was rewriting him in real time, my father's laugh, his fishing trips, even the way he fixed the leaky faucet, each memory bent toward her version. Buzz each with a voicemail from Dad. A sudden lull in conversation gave me cover. I set the coffee pot down, walked toward the hall, and let the sound of voices fade behind me. With a voicemail from Dad, The study door stood ajar, my pulse thudded as I slipped inside. The air smelled faintly of polish, but under it was something else. Old paper and dust. Tuffrance with a voicemail from Dad. And the ledger was gone. On the desk, a faint rectangle of cleaner wood, marked where it had sat. I opened drawers one by one. Receipts, a box of fountain pens. One of my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, an envelope with my father's handwriting. Empty inside, a floorboard creaked in the hall. I closed the drawer softly and moved to the window. When my phone buzzed with a voice from Dad, through the glass, I could see the side garden where Judith stood with the man from earlier, their heads close. With a voicemail from Dad, her hand resting briefly on his arm before she glanced toward the house. I ducked back, heart racing. On the edge of the bookshelf, a voicemail from Dad, my fingers brushed something metallic. A key, smaller than the brass one in my coat. Fied, with a tag that read, Shed. I slipped it into my pocket just as footsteps approached. Margaret. Judith's voice floated in, light and controlled, with a voicemail from Dad. The guests are asking for more cream. She appeared in the doorway, her eyes glancing once over the desk, then to me, with a voicemail from Dad. Were you looking for something? I was just remembering the room, I said. The pause between us stretched until she smiled. Us, Mum, Dad. Of course, she said. Memories are all we have, aren't they? Back in the living room, she was already the gracious hostess again, refilling glasses, with a voicemail from Dad, offering tarts. No one noticed me settle into a corner seat, the new key pressed against my palm, warm now from my grip. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the luncheon wound down as the sky turned the pale gold of early evening. Guests filtered out with handshakes and parting kisses. Judith walked them to the door, with a voicemail from Dad, her laugh trailing after them like perfume. When she returned, her eyes landed on me. For a moment, the smile faltered. With a voicemail from Dad, just enough for me to see something underneath, calculation, maybe fear. I'll tidy up, I said. She nodded, already turning away. In the kitchen, with a voicemail from Dad, I let the water run over my hands longer than needed, the sound covering the rhythm of my thoughts. 2 keys now, one for a lock I didn't know, with a voicemail from Dad, and one for a shed I'd ignored for years. If Judith had hidden the ledger, maybe she'd hidden other things too. And maybe, for the first time, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I was close enough to touch them. The morning broke gray and salt heavy, the kind of air that stuck to your skin before you'd even stepped outside. With a voicemail from Dad. From my bedroom window, I could see the shed, small, weathered, tucked against the hedge line like it wanted to be forgotten. Judith's car was gone. With a voicemail from Dad. She'd left early for what she called an appointment in town. Her voice clipped, no extra words offered. My mom buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I waited until the sound of her engine faded down the street before slipping the shed key from my pocket. Still, my feet moved slowly down the hall. With a voicemail from Dad, the house quieter than it had been in years. I passed the study, its door now closed, a faint scent of lavender drifting from underneath. Judith's doing, Bushevef with a voicemail from Dad. She was claiming space in her own way, sending it like an animal marking territory. By the back door, Emily's note waited on the counter of a school project. With a voicemail from Dad, will be late, a small pang hit me, relief that she wouldn't be underfoot. Wilner buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. But also the ache missing her presence in a house that was beginning to feel less like mine with every hour. The yard was damp from last night's fog. With a voicemail from Dad. Each step across the grass released the smell of wet earth, mingled with the faint tang of rust from the garden tools leaning against the fence. When my phone buzzed with a voice from Dad, the shed stood locked, its paint flaking in thin curls. I turned the key. The lock resisted at first, as if it hadn't been touched in years. With it, a voicemail. For a loud click echoed, too sharp in the morning stillness. My breath held. The door groaned open to a rush of air tinged with oil, mildew, and something metallic. Twad the light filth smell from Dad Lod, legal filtered in through a dusty window, casting a pale square onto the workbench. Boxes lined the walls, some labeled. Nails. A paint rope, others blank. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I moved slowly, scanning for anything out of place. A tarp covered a shape in the corner, large but oddly low to the ground. With a voicemail from Dad. Pulling it back revealed an old trunk, its brass corners tarnished. A travel sticker peeling from one side. My heart climbed into my throat. Fornman fosed with the Vliesel, front from Dad. The trunk had no lock, just a latch inside, layers of cloth, an old fishing jacket, folded blankets, a stack of newspapers yellowed to the color of tea. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The top paper dated nearly 2 years ago, the week before Judith married my father. I turned the page. Everyone in the stack from that same week buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, all folded open to the local business section. Footsteps crunched on gravel outside. My pulse spiked. I closed the trunk, dropped the tarp with a voicemail from Dad, and turned toward the door. It wasn't Judith. It was the mail carrier sliding envelopes into the box at the gate. I waited until he left, my breath slowing, with a voicemail from Dad. Still, I felt exposed, like eyes were on me. Before leaving, I scanned the bench again. A small tin sat near the back, labeled in my father's handwriting. So I buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, full of boat keys, but when I shook it, something rattled inside, too small for keys. I opened it. Inside, a folded scrap of paper, edges brittle. Just one line written in his hand, "The not for her." I stared at the words until they blurred. Had he meant Judith? Or someone else? With a voicemail from Dad. Part of me wanted to believe it was simple. Another piece of proof that he'd seen her for what she was. Another part, quieter and heavier, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Wondered if there was something he hadn't trusted me with, either. I slipped the note into my pocket and left the shed, locking it behind me, with a voicemail from Dad. The morning had warmed slightly, but I felt colder walking back across the grass. Through the kitchen window, Judith's car was back in the drive, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. She stood by the trunk, her hand resting on the edge as she looked toward the garden, with a voicemail from Dad. Her eyes tracked the line of the hedge, right to where the shed was hidden from the street. I kept moving, head down, the tin still in my pocket, though when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Burning against my side, I didn't go straight upstairs. Instead, I moved to the pantry, its narrow space giving me cover from the kitchen window. For a moment buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Through the slats in the door, I could still see Judith outside. She was on her phone now, her expression taut, with a voicemail from Dad. Her free hand drumming lightly on the trunk of her car. That drumming, it had rhythm, deliberate. My father used to do the same when he was impatient, with a voicemail from Dad. I wondered if she'd picked it up from him, or if it was hers all along. The note in my pocket felt heavier than paper should, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Not for her. My father's handwriting, steady and unshaken, the same as the lists he used to leave me for the hardware store. What buzzed with a voicemail from Dad? But this wasn't a list. It was a warning, and one he'd hidden inside a tin labeled for something else. Judith disappeared from view. I waited. One I buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Counting to 30 before stepping out and slipping the note into the back of my recipe box, beneath a tattered card for my mother's lemon cake. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, if Judith ever went through my things, she'd start with the obvious desk drawers, jewelry boxes. With a voicemail from Dad, not the index cards of a recipe box she'd probably never touched. By mid-afternoon, the house felt smaller, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, as if the walls had shifted in when I wasn't looking. I made tea, the clink of the spoon in the mug louder than it should have been. Quiver to the voicemail from Dad. Judith came in through the front door, carrying a bag from the antique store in town. She set it on the counter with a soft thud. "Quiet day?" she asked, and the voice level, eyes scanning the room. "Mostly," I said. "And yours?" She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. Worried when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Productive. She didn't ask where I'd been. That was almost worse. If she suspected, she was playing a longer game. Later, in my room, I called Daniel. The moment he picked up, his voice was a quiet anchor. "You found something?" He said, not a question. A note. In his handwriting, it says, "Silence. Then." Where was it? In the shed, inside a tin marked boat keys. He exhaled slowly, with a voicemail from Dad. Do you think it's about Judith?" I want to say yes, but I'm not sure. Could be someone else. We arranged to meet the next morning, early, before Judith was likely to stir. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. He'd bring a portable scanner and see if the paper or ink could be dated. Anything to pin it to a time before or after her arrival. After I hung up. When the phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I sat on the edge of the balcony. The faint creak of floorboards came from the hallway. 2 steps, then nothing. I opened the door. The hall was empty. Radar buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Still, I had the sense of something having just moved away. Dinner was quiet. Judith spoke about a fundraiser she was planning, with a voicemail from Dad, her fork tapping the plate between sentences. I nodded where appropriate, my mind elsewhere, replaying the crunch of gravel from earlier, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the way her eyes had lingered toward the shed. When the dishes were done, she lingered in the kitchen, wiping the same counter corner over and over. "You should rest," she said without looking at me. I will. You upstairs, I pulled the curtains but left a narrow gap. From my window, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I could see her walk across the lawn toward the hedge. She stopped short of the shed, looked around, and then, as if thinking better of it, turned back. With a voicemail from Dad, I stepped away from the window, heart ticking faster. She knew, or at least she guessed. The note in the recipe box wasn't just a clue anymore. It was a fuse. With a voicemail from Dad, and I had no idea how long before it reached the flame. Sleep didn't come. The ceiling above me was a pale blur in the moonlight. With a voicemail from Dad, the shadows from the tree outside crawling slowly across it. Somewhere in the distance, a Bowie bell rang. Faint, rhythmic. With a voicemail from Dad, the same sound that used to lull me to sleep as a child. Tonight it only kept me awake. I rolled onto my side when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the brass key pressing into my hip through the fabric of my robe. It was absurd to sleep with it in the pocket, but I couldn't leave it on the nightstand. Phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Not now. Not with the way Judith had hovered near the shed earlier, as if drawn to the place without meaning to show it. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I closed my eyes and tried to summon my father's voice, the steady calm that could settle me even in storms. I could almost hear him. Don't rush the tide. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, Maggie, it'll come to you. But underneath that memory was a flicker of doubt. Had he known what Judith was doing? When buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, had he invited her into places that were supposed to be ours? That question kept looping. I pressed my palm against the key, as if the metal could answer me. When I buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, when the clock in the hall struck 2, I got up. The air was cold on my bare feet as I padded to the window. From here the yard looked different, longer, with a voicemail from Dad. Deeper, as if it had grown in the night. The shed was just a shadow at the far edge, but I could picture the tin, the neat fold of the note. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the ink, I thought of the study, now stripped bare. Judith had taken the books, the framed map. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the small drawer in his desk that used to stick. She said it was for freshness, but there was nothing fresh about those empty walls. With a voicemail from Dad, I imagined her tracing her finger along the outline where the bookshelf had been, pausing, considering whether to pry further. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I sat at my desk and pulled a notepad from the drawer. The first page was blank for a long time. Then I began to write. Not a confession, not a plan exactly. Fragments. Dates I could remember. Questions to ask Daniel. People in town who'd known my father longer than Judith had. Outside, a voicemail from Dad. A gust rattled the loose pane in the guest room window. When buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the sound made me think of another night, years ago, when my father had come in from the shed smelling faintly of engine oil and cedar. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, he'd locked it something in the attic that night, telling me only that some things are worth keeping out of sight. I'd been too young to press him. Now, format my phone, because with a voicemail from Dad I couldn't stop pressing. By 4, my handwriting had tightened, the letters small and deliberate. The list was longer than I expected. The will's witnesses. Buzzed with a voicemail Dad, the carpenter who'd worked on the attic door, the retired notary. And one name I hesitated over, Mr. Larkin. He'd been my father's friend for decades. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, but in the past year I'd seen him at the house less and less. Judith always said he'd moved away. I tore the page from the pad, folded it, with a voicemail from Dad, and slipped it into the pocket opposite the key. 2 weights now, 1 metal, 1 paper, both pressing me toward something I hadn't yet defined. Sipping my light when my phosed with a voicemail from Dad, the first gray of dawn seeped into the room. Downstairs the floorboards creaked. Just once, near the kitchen, I held still, listening. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. If Judith was awake this early, she had a reason. And if I was going to find the truth, I needed to move before she did. With a voicemail from Dad. By the time the sky had turned from slate to pale gold, I was dressed and moving. The house was still, with a voicemail from Dad. But I couldn't shake the sense that it was holding its breath. I avoided the creaky steps, keeping my hand on the banister to steady myself. In the kitchen, buzz with a voicemail from Dad. The faint scent of coffee lingered, strong and stronger than mine. Judith's brand, she'd been up. That much was certain. With a voicemail from Dad. The mug in the sink was still warm when I touched it. I left through the side door. When my phone buzzed was with a voicemail from Dad, the one that opened onto the narrow path between the hedge and the neighbor's fence. My boots sank slightly into the damp earth. Voicemail from Dad. Dad moved. Every sound seemed too loud, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. But the morning air sharpened my focus. Daniel's office was a 10-minute walk. With a voicemail from Dad. The streets were empty, save for a newspaper boy on a bike who didn't look up as I passed. I'd called ahead from the old payphone by the harbor, with a voicemail from Dad. The one I knew Judith would never think to check. When Daniel opened the door, his tie was crooked, and his eyes were still heavy with sleep. With a voicemail from Dad. "You said it couldn't wait?" he murmured, stepping aside. I pulled the folded paper from my coat and laid it on his desk. He read it twice without speaking, but a voicemail from Dad, his brow tightening with each pass. "This isn't just a note," he said finally. "It's a map." Then I frowned. With a voicemail from Dad. A map to what? Oh, he tapped the corner of the paper where my father's handwriting had dipped, almost as if he'd been interrupted. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, these coordinates, if I'm reading them right, aren't to anything on this property. They're further. The brass key felt heavier in my pocket when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. So whatever it is, Judith doesn't have it yet. Daniel's gaze flicked to the window, the street beyond. Not unless she knows more than we think. With a voicemail from Dad. "How long have you had this?" "Oh, since the day after the funeral." His jaw tightened. "Then we don't have much time." So I leaned back. Was buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Letting his words settle, outside a gull cried, the sound cutting through the quiet like a warning. "We'll start by verifying the location," he said. With a voicemail from Dad. "Quietly, I'll talk to someone at the county records office. Someone I trust. Someone, and Judith." Now he hesitated. "For now, don't confront her." First I met with one a voicemail from Dodd from Dad. "The less she knows about what you're doing, the better." To I nodded, though of me bristled at the idea of letting her think she was winning. This was mail from Dad, but this wasn't about pride. Not yet. On the walk back, I kept to the side streets, avoiding the main road where she might be. The sun was higher now, with a voicemail from Dad, glinting off the water in the harbor. From this angle, the shed was just a dark shape in the yard, but I could almost feel its pull. With buzz with a voicemail from Dad. As I slipped through the side gate, I froze. The padlock on the shed door hung open. I crossed the yard slowly, every step measured. Inside, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the air was thick with the scent of oil and old wood. The shelves were bare. The spot where the toolbox had been was empty. With a voicemail from Dad, dust-free as if it had been lifted only minutes ago. My fingers closed around the key in my pocket. If she'd found the box, I was already behind. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, but if she hadn't, if she was still searching, then I still had the advantage. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest trace of jasmine into the shed. With a voicemail from Dad. She'd been here. I locked the door behind me and slipped the key back into my coat. The game had already started. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I just need to make sure I was the one setting the rules. The morning after the shed? How am I? But from Dad, I moved like someone carrying a fragile glass inside her chest. Every step deliberate, careful not to draw notice. Judith had already left, with a voicemail from Dad. The front door closing behind her with that soft, deliberate click she used when she wanted to seem harmless. Was a voicemail from Dad. I watched from the upstairs window until her car disappeared around the bend. Then I went to work. The first call was to the bank. I kept my voice steady, with a voicemail from Dad, explaining I needed to update signature authority on the accounts tied to the property. "Routine housekeeping," I said, smiling as if they could see me. With a voicemail from Dad, the manager, an old classmate of my father's, didn't ask questions. By the time I hung up, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the joint account Judith had insisted on after the wedding no longer existed. Next came the insurance office, with a voicemail from Dad. I'd learned long ago that most battles weren't won in court. They were won in the margins, in the quiet corners where paperwork lived. With a voicemail from Dad. I reviewed every policy, striking her name wherever it appeared. The woman on the other end hesitated only once. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. "Are you sure you want to remove your stepmother from the—" "Yes," I said, and let the word sit. The study felt colder when I stepped inside. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Judith had stripped it bare weeks ago, but I still found myself searching for the ghost of my father's presence. Sipping my latte when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the indent in the carpet where his desk had been, a faint ring on the wall from a clock that now hung somewhere else, ticking for someone else. Quiffen fills my dome with a voicemail from Dad. I set my own stack of folders on the floor and began sorting. Deeds, receipts, letters. Anything that might connect to the coordinates Daniel had found. With a voicemail from Dad. Anything she might try to erase. By mid-morning, the light through the front windows had shifted, sharpening the dust in the air. With a voicemail from Dad. I heard the faint growl of an engine outside and froze. Her car. Too soon. I slid the folders into the hall closet, tucking them behind an old quilt. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. By the time she stepped inside, shrugging off her coat, I was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, flipping through a recipe book. "Home early?" I said, glancing with a voicemail from Dad. Glancing up just enough to catch her expression. "Errands finished quicker than I thought." She moved to the counter, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the scent of jasmine following her like a second skin. Her eyes flicked toward the hallway, then back to me. "What did you do with your morning?" I sipped the tea. "Just sorting through some of Dad's things." She smiled. "A thin, precise thing." Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. "He kept so much unnecessary paper." I let the comment pass. When she disappeared upstairs, I allowed myself a single breath. She was suspicious, yes, with a voicemail from Dad, but suspicion was a weak weapon without proof. That afternoon, I walked to the post office with a voicemail from Dad, the brass key in my coat pocket and a bundle of documents under my arm. I mailed a small package to Daniel. Copies of everything I'd found that morning, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. If Judith searched the house, she'd find nothing. The clerk, a woman with hair the color of winter wheat, Gleismandal from glanced at the return address and gave me a knowing look. "Family business?" Something like that. On the walk back, with a voicemail from Dad, the wind came off the water hard enough to sting. I pulled my coat tighter, feeling the edges of resolve settle deeper. What if funds with a voicemail from Dad? This wasn't about matching Judith move for move. It was about changing the game entirely, taking away the board she thought she was playing on. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, when I reached the house, the curtains in the front room shifted, just slightly, as if someone had been watching for me. I stepped inside, with a voicemail from Dad, but the scent of her perfume still hanging in the air. The hallway was empty, but the upstairs floorboards creaked. She was home. And for the first time, when phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I didn't care if she knew I was moving pieces she couldn't see. I kept my movements slow that evening, and then buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The way you move in a dark room you know well but can't see clearly. Measured, cautious, always aware of where your next step might land. With a voicemail from Dad. Judith moved around upstairs, her heels clicking lightly against the hardwood. I used the noise to mask my own. In the kitchen, I opened the small drawer by the refrigerator. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the one my father had once called the real safe. Beneath takeout menus and a collection of half-dead pens sat the lockbox. The key turned without a sound. Friend. With a voicemail from Dad, inside lay his personal address book, a fountain pen worn smooth by decades of use, and an envelope marked in his careful handwriting for Margaret. With a voicemail from Dad, I didn't open it yet, not with her above me, the ceiling creaking under her pace. My phone mail from Dad. I slipped the envelope into my cardigan pocket and replaced everything else exactly as I'd found it. At night, I sat in my room with the lamp low, with a voicemail from Dad. The letter was short, 2 paragraphs, no date. He wrote of the property as if it were a living thing, something meant to be cared for, not traded. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. "If anything happens to me, keep it in the family. Don't let anyone convince you it's theirs to take." The paper shook in my hands. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Judith's laugh drifted up the stairs, muffled by the walls. I folded the letter and slid it into the inner lining of my purse. The next morning, with a voicemail from Dad. I left before sunrise. The bank opened at 9, but the courthouse opened at 8, and I wanted the early light on my side. The clerk, with a voicemail from Dad, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, didn't look up when I requested certified copies of the original deed. $2 a page? He murmured, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, pulling a manila folder from the archives. I paid in cash. Walking out, I spotted a familiar car parked across the street. Judith's, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The driver's seat was empty, but the passenger window was cracked. I kept moving, resisting the urge to look around for her. Back at the house, 40 faldigo my voicemail from Dad. She was one pruning roses with a precision that looked more like dissection. "Morning," she said without looking up. "Early start," I replied. With a voicemail from Dad, holding my coat closed against the wind. Her eyes flicked to the folder under my arm. "Paperwork?" I smiled thinly. "From Dad?" "Just settling a few loose ends." Out in the study, I placed the folder in the bottom of a box already half filled with books. Daniel would pick it up later. From the Dad, disguised as donations for the Historical Society. By afternoon, my plan had nearly unraveled. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The insurance office called to confirm the removal of her name from the policies. I answered in the kitchen, turning my back to the doorway. Was sipping when my phone buzzed with voicemail from Dad, but halfway through the conversation I caught her reflection in the glass of the cabinet. She stood in the hall, head tilted, watch, and I ended the call quickly with a voicemail from Dad, forcing my tone into something casual. Just sorting some bills. Her mouth twitched in something between a smile and a warning. With a voicemail from Dad, she stepped away without a word. When I hung up, my pulse thudded against my throat. She knew something was shifting. When my phosed with a voicemail from Dad, even if she couldn't see the whole board yet, that night I packed a small box of items to take to Daniel. Photographs, letters, the certified deed. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from I kept the brass key in my pocket, its weight constant, a reminder that there was still more to uncover. Before bed, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I passed the study and saw the roses she'd been pruning earlier, now arranged in a vase on the empty desk. Their scent was thick, cloying, almost metallic. But supposed with a voicemail from I closed the door gently. The game was moving faster now, pieces sliding toward a collision neither of us could avoid. She didn't know it yet, but my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, but by the time she saw the full shape of my plan, there would be no way back. The morning broke sharp and pale, the kind of light that made every flaw visible. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I'd been awake for lying in bed with the brass key pressed into my palm. At 7, I rose, dressed in layers, and locked my door before heading out. When did the voicemail from Judith's car was still in the drive. She never moved before 9 unless she had somewhere important to be. That gave me 2 hours. At the bank, when I buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the air smelled faintly of coffee and new carpet. The manager, a man I'd known since high school, shook my hand with a quiet familiarity. "We got your message," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. I opened it to see every account, my father's business holdings. A voicemail from Dad, the property trust, now listed under my sole authority. The signature line was the only thing between us and finality. The pen felt heavier than it should have. When I buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, as I signed, I imagined Judith's face when she realized what these papers meant. Not anger, something colder. The manager slid the documents into a sealed envelope. "We'll have the changes reflected by noon." "What do you don't buzz with at the Wolfone? Do you want me to call him on the call when it's done?" "No," I said. "I'll know." By the time I stepped back into the street, when my phone's with a voicemail from Dad, the sun had cleared the rooftops. I walked to the post office next, mailing duplicates of the documents to Daniel. Insurance, property. Would have buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Financial, he'd have everything sealed and time-stamped. When I returned home, the front door stood slightly ajar. For a moment, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I thought the wind had caught it. But then I heard movement in the study, soft, deliberate. Judith emerged holding one of the old ledgers from the bookshelf, with a voicemail from Dad. She looked up, a faint smile curving her lips. "Your father kept such meticulous records. I'm trying to make sense of them." And I stepped inside, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, closing the door behind me. Some things aren't meant to be understood by everyone. Her smile didn't falter, but her gaze sharpened, with a voicemail from Dad. "Transparency is important in a household, Margaret." I hung my coat and walked past her to the kitchen, every step measured. She followed a moment later. "From Dad," setting the ledger on the counter. "You were out early," she said. "Just errands." Her eyes flicked toward my purse. Was Swirvale from Dad, as if she could see the envelope tucked inside. "Anything I should know about?" "Not today." I poured myself tea, levised with it a voicemail from Dad. Letting the silence stretch between us, she picked up the ledger again and left without another word. Upstairs, with a voicemail from Dad, I locked my bedroom door and retrieved the envelope from my purse. Noon was only 2 hours away. Once the bank systems updated, with a voicemail from Dad, her name would vanish from every account. The clock on my nightstand ticked loud enough to feel in my bones. I glanced toward the window. Across the lawn, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, and she stood by the roses again, pruning stems with a slow precision. The sun caught the edge of her shears, flashing like a signal. She was waiting for something. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. So was I. By 11, the air inside the house felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I tried to read in the living room, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, but every creak from upstairs made me glance toward the staircase. Judith's footsteps came slow, measured, pausing between each one. When she entered, with the voicemail from Dad, she carried a small silver tray for 2. She set it on the coffee table with the grace of someone accustomed to performance. "I thought we might have a moment," she said. "Just us." I closed my book. "All right." She poured the tea, her movements precise. Forland, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The liquid caught the light, a warm amber that should have been comforting. Instead, it looked like something you could drown in. A voicemail from Dad. "I've been thinking about the property," she began, passing me a cup. "About how much work it takes. Too much for one person." With a voicemail from Dad, really, I sipped without answering. My eyes stayed on the clock above the mantel. 11:05. Judith leaned back, cradling her own cup. From Dodd. "Your father wanted the house to be practical." With a voicemail from Dad, managed by someone who could handle the responsibility. Knew the way she said, "someone" left no doubt she meant herself. I set my cup down. With a voicemail from Dad, the porcelain clicking softly against the saucer. Responsibility isn't always about possession. Her gaze held mine for a beat too long. With a voicemail from Dad, then she smiled, thin, unreadable, and stood. "You should rest, Margaret, you look tired," as she left the room. With a voicemail from Dad, I caught a glimpse of the study door closing behind her. The urge to follow was strong, but I stayed seated. When buzz with a voicemail from Dad, listening to the faint rustle of paper from the other side. At 11:20, I went upstairs to my room. Phone buzz with a voicemail from Dad. The envelope from the bank lay in the top drawer of my desk, its seal unbroken. My hands itched to open it to see the proof in black and white. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, but I didn't need to bite. Now the updates would be in motion. I sat at my desk, pen poised over a blank page, and began writing a list. Every account buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Every asset, every lock in the house. The brass key lay beside the paper, catching the late morning light. A sharp knock at my door broke the rhythm. With a voicemail from Dad, Judith's voice came through, warm in tone but cool in intent. "Margaret, do you have a moment?" I opened the door halfway. With a voicemail from Dad. She stood there with another ledger in hand. "I can't find the maintenance records for the shed," she said. With a voicemail from Dad. "Do you know where they are?" "They'll turn up," I replied, keeping my voice even. Her eyes dropped briefly to the key on my desk. With a voicemail from Dad. When she looked back up, the smile was gone. "I'll keep looking." She turned and walked away, her steps faster now. I closed the door and locked it. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The clock read 11:40. 20 minutes until everything shifted. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the bare branches against the siding. Downstairs, with a voicemail from Dad, a door slammed, hard enough to send a vibration through the floor. I took a deep breath, slid the key into my pocket, and waited. At exactly 12, with a voicemail from Dad, the grandfather clock in the hall began its slow, resonant chime. I rose from my chair, the brass key heavy in my pocket, and walked downstairs. With a voicemail from Dad. Judith was in the study, the ledger spread open before her. Her pen hovered above the page but didn't move. She looked up as I entered, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. "What are you doing in here?" she asked. No warmth now, just the clipped edge of someone already on guard. "I thought it was time we talked," I said, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Closing the door behind me, she straightened, folding her hands on the desk. "If this is about the property again, it's about everything," I said. My voice was calm, steady. "The accounts. The house. The shed." Oh, her brows drew together, a flicker of something. Confusion, fear? Crossing her face? With a voicemail from Dad. "I don't know what you mean." I stepped closer, placing the envelope from the bank on the desk. The seal was broken now. "This is the voicemail from Dad. This is the updated title and account information. As of this morning, everything is under my name. All locks have been changed." Judith's lips parted. With a voicemail from Dad, then closed again. Her gaze darted the window as though she could find an escape there. "You can't just," she began. "I can," I said. With a voicemail from Dad. Cutting her half. The bank confirmed it at 10. The locksmith finished by 11. Her breath caught. She pushed back her chair. "Standing too quickly?" "You've gone behind my back?" "I followed my father's will," I said. "The real one?" Her face blanched. "Foist a mail from Dad." "That was," verified, witnessed. "Filed." I didn't raise my voice, but each word landed with the weight of a gavel. Silence swelled between us. With a voicemail from Dad. Broken only by the wind rattling the window panes. She reached for the ledger, then stopped, her hand hovering in midair before dropping to her side. "4 of them," buzzed with a voicemail fad. You've made a mistake," she said finally, but her voice had lost its shape. I placed the brass key on the desk between us. With it, a voicemail from Dad. This opens the trunk in the attic, the one you had moved without telling me. I suggest you leave it where it is. Her eyes stayed on the key, unmoving. With a voicemail from Dad. For the first time since I'd met her, Judith looked smaller, as though the air around her had thinned. You've been planning this, she said, with a voicemail from Dad, almost to herself. I've been protecting what was mine. I replied. Clock ticked, loud in the stillness. Finally, Judith stepped back from the desk. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, she didn't look at me as she brushed past, her perfume trailing in the air, sharper now than sweet. I stood alone in the study, the envelope in one hand. I buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the key in the other. Outside, the sky had cleared, sunlight spilling across the floorboards. It was over. Not with shouting. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Tactical, but with the quiet closing of a door, and somewhere beneath the dust and locked drawers, the truth still waited. Only now, a buzz with a voicemail from Dad, I would decide when it came to light. The first morning after was almost too quiet. No creak of Judith's heels across the hall. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, no sound of drawers opening in rooms that weren't hers. Just the wind off the ocean brushing against the shutters. With a voicemail from Dad, and the low hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen, I poured coffee into my mug and let the steam rise into my face. The cup felt warm, grounding, when a phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, as though I needed proof that the past 24 hours had been real. Sunlight came in thin bands through the curtains, striping the table, the floor, my hands. Forth with a voicemail from Dad. Judith's door had stayed closed all evening yesterday. I'd heard her on the phone once, low, clipped words, but after that, nothing. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the absence had a weight of its own, heavier than her presence. I walked the length of the hallway slowly, my fingers brushing the familiar frames on the wall, with a voicemail from Dad. My parents' wedding photo, a picture of my father on the dock, sleeves rolled up, smiling in the salt air. It felt strange to look at him now, with a voicemail from Dad. Knowing the choices he'd made in those last years, and the protections he'd quietly left for me. In the study, the air smelled faintly of dust and varnish, with a voicemail from Dad. The desk was just as I'd left it, the bank papers stacked neatly, the brass key resting on top. I picked it up, feeling its edges press into my palm. With a voicemail from Dad, the metal was cool, even in the morning light. I didn't unlock the trunk. Not yet. Instead, I opened the window. The ocean was restless. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the waves folding over themselves, foam catching the sun. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe without watching for someone at my back. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Footsteps sounded behind me, slow and deliberate. Judith stood in the doorway, wearing a pale sweater I'd never seen before. Her face was drawn. With a voicemail from Dad. Her hair pulled back as though she'd aged 10 years overnight. I'll be leaving this week, she said. No explanation, no argument. Just the statement. The voicemail Dad delivered in a voice stripped of its usual polish. I nodded once. With a voicemail from Dad. I hope you find somewhere that suits you. Her eyes flicked to the key in my hand but didn't linger. With own buzzvan with a voicemail from Dad. Some things aren't worth the fight, she said quietly and turned away. When she was gone, I stayed by the window watching the horizon, with a voicemail from Dad. I didn't know if her words were resignation or a warning. The rest of the day moved in small rituals, laundry folded, dishes stacked, the front porch swept. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I found comfort in the ordinary, in the way a house could sound like itself again once the tension drained from its walls. By late afternoon, clouds gathered. With a voicemail from Dad, I lit a lamp in the living room, the soft amber glow filling the corners. Sitting there, I let my mind wander to the attic. From Dad, what if the trunk held answers I wasn't ready for? Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. What if it confirmed fears I'd pushed aside, that my father had trusted her with things he hadn't trusted me? The thought stayed with me. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Like a low tide pulling at my ankles. As evening settled, I set the key on the side table and leaned back. The ocean's rhythm was steady in the distance, with a voicemail from Dad, matching my own breath. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't moving out of fear or defense. I was simply still. But the lock upstairs remained, with a voicemail from Dad, and with it, the truth that would eventually have to be faced. Judith kept her word. By Wednesday morning, her suitcases were stacked by the front door, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, lined up like an exit strategy. She didn't knock on my bedroom door or linger in the kitchen. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, she moved through the house like someone erasing herself from a photograph. Quiet, efficient, without looking back. I stayed out of the way when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. But I heard the low rumble of the taxi in the drive, the muffled thud of her luggage against the trunk. The front door clicked shut, and then she was gone. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The silence that followed was different from before. Not tense, not guarded, just space. Open, breathable space. I made coffee and carried it to the porch. With a voicemail from Dad. The morning was cool, the air edged with salt. Gulls circled above the shoreline, their cries sharp against the steady whisper of the tide. With a voicemail from Dad. The house felt like mine again, even if some corners still held her shadow. In the days that followed, I began to reclaim the rooms. When my phone buzzed for the voicemail from Dad at the guest bedroom, her strip too long was stripped bare. I pulled open the curtains, let the light in. The study I left as it was for now. With a voicemail from Dad, that space would be its own battle. I found little reminders tucked in strange places. A silk scarf folded in the pantry drawer. With a voicemail from Dad. A single earring on the bathroom counter. Things she'd either forgotten or abandoned, each one carrying the faint trace of her perfume. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I gathered them into a box and set it by the back door. I wasn't sure if I'd throw them away or leave them somewhere neutral. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, all I knew was they didn't belong here anymore. At night, the house settled in a way it hadn't for months. The floorboards sighed instead of groaned. With a voicemail from Dad, the wind moved through the eaves without resistance. I could hear the ocean from my bedroom window. With a voicemail from Dad, and it no longer sounded like a reminder of everything that had been taken. It sounded like it had before, a steady, familiar presence. With a voicemail from Dad, I started taking walks down to the pier again. The boards were weathered, the rails bleached from sun and salt. Standing at the end, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I'd look back toward the hill where the house sat, the roof just visible through the trees. It didn't feel like a place under siege anymore. Still, with a voicemail from Dad, there was the matter of the attic. The brass key stayed on the desk, catching the afternoon light. Sometimes I'd pass the study and glance inside, with a voicemail from Dad. I half expecting to see Judith standing there, her fingers grazing the spines of books, her eyes calculating. The image would fade, but the feeling lingered, with a voicemail from Dad. On Sunday, I stood at the base of the attic stairs, the key warm in my palm. I told myself I was just checking the latch, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, making sure nothing had shifted in the last week. But my heart was steady in my chest, and that steadiness told me I was getting closer to turning it. The house buzzed with a voicemail from the land. The memories, they were all here, waiting for me to decide what to do with them. And for the first time, with a voicemail from Dad. I realized that this wasn't just about keeping what was mine. It was about deciding what came next. I turned away from the stairs and went back to the kitchen. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, where the kettle was beginning to sing, the lock could wait one more night. The truth wasn't going anywhere. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow, I'd be ready. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The morning broke with a clear, glass blue sky. Sunlight poured through the kitchen window, catching on the brass key resting beside my coffee cup. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I dreamed about it again, my father's hand closing over mine, the weight of the metal pressing into my palm. This time, he didn't say a word. Foreign buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. He just looked at me, steady and sure, as if I already knew what I had to do. I climbed the attic stairs slowly, each step groaning under my weight. When friends that I buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, dust rose in thin spirals as I turned the key. The lock gave with a soft click, the kind of sound that feels final. The air inside was cooler, with a voicemail from Dad, tinged with cedar and old paper. Light slipped through a narrow dormer window, cutting a sharp line across the floorboards. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Everything was as I remembered, neatly stacked boxes, a trunk with brass corners, the rocking chair my mother used to sit in on summer nights. Was with a voicemail from Dad. I went to the trunk first, the lid resisted, then gave way with a sigh of hinges. Inside, layers of fabric, my mother's quilt, with a voicemail from Dad. A folded navy sweater that still held the faint scent of her lavender soap. Beneath them, a bundle of letters bound with fraying ribbon. Comb buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. My father's handwriting, loop and deliberate, covered the envelopes. I sat on the floor, the wood cool beneath me, and opened the top letter. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. It was dated more than a year before his death. The words were for me, each one careful, deliberate. He wrote about the land, the house. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The history that ran deeper than either of us had guessed. He warned me that not everyone would honor it the way it deserved. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, that I might need to protect it even from those who claim to love it. As I read, I felt the ache of missing him sharpen and soften all at once. The voicemail from Dad, his voice was here woven into the paper, steady as the tide. He had known, he had seen something in Judith, maybe not the details, but if my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, but enough to leave this for me, there were other envelopes, each marked with a year. Some were for birthdays I'd already had, others for ones still to come. With a voicemail from Dad, the thought of opening them all at once felt wrong. They were meant to guide me, not flood me. I put the letters back, one by one, and closed the trunk. With a voicemail from Dad. The attic was quiet again, but different. Less like a sealed room, more like a held breath waiting to be released. Downstairs, the kettle began its low whistle. Four in the wood and my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I left the key in the lock this time, the door ajar. Whatever came next, the attic would not be a place of secrets anymore. It would be part of the house again. With a voicemail from Dad, part of me again. I poured the water over fresh tea leaves, the steam curling upward. Outside, the gulls wheeled over the shore. When my phone light buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, their cries sharpened the still morning air. It felt like the first day in a long time that truly belonged to me. By late afternoon, the light had shifted. Voicemail from Dad, warm gold pooling on the worn oak floors. I'd spent the morning in the village, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, speaking with a carpenter about repairing the attic windows and restoring the study to how my father kept it. His shelves would hold books again. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The desk would have fresh paper, a pen ready for anyone who wanted to write. When I came back, the air smelled faintly of salt and bread, Mrs. With a voicemail from Dad. Carver from down the road had left a loaf on my porch, wrapped in a clean kitchen towel. No note, just the quiet language of neighbors who still cared. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I set it on the counter, poured 2 cups of tea, and took one out to the back steps. The sea was restless today, rolling in steady, deliberate waves. With thought of my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I thought of all the years I'd sat here with my father, both of us content to let silence be the truest conversation. Would a phone with a voicemail Dad, the brass key still hung from the attic lock, a small glint in the dim hallway. I liked seeing it there, open, honest. The nettle 5th my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The attic was no longer a vault for secrets, but a room waiting to be lived in. Maybe I'd turn it into a reading room with the rocking chair by the window. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the quilt over it. A week ago, I might have thought of leaving, selling the house, escaping the memories. Now, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I understood that staying wasn't about clinging to the past. It was about deciding what deserved to carry forward. In the days that followed, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I began writing letters of my own, some to friends I'd drifted from, others to Emily, my niece. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, telling her the stories my father had told me, when she was too young to remember, I wanted her to know this place is more than just a house. Mata buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I wanted her to know why it mattered. Judith's name didn't cross my mind often, though when it did, it no longer carried the heat of anger. With a voicemail from Dad, she had taken her share of shadows with her. I hoped in some corner of her life, she found what she was chasing. I no longer needed to understand it. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail of Dad, one evening, as the sun sank low and the tide curled in on itself, I unlocked the shed. Inside, among the tools and the faint smell of engine oil, the fur-doof buzzed with a voicemail for Dad. I found my father's old canoe box. Not the toolbox I'd feared was gone, but something smaller, simpler. Inside was a folded scrap of paper with a voicemail from Dad. A single sentence in his hand, build something worth leaving behind. I stood there for a long moment, the gulls calling overhead. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the paper soft between my fingers, the words were not a demand. They were an invitation, so I locked the shed, turned toward the house, and stepped inside. I was sipping my lie when phoned with a voicemail from Dad. Tomorrow I would begin not rebuilding what was lost, but creating what could last. The kettle began its quiet boil, the bread waited on the counter, with a voicemail from Dad, and the sea kept its rhythm. The day was closing, but the story wasn't over. Not yet.